Okay, so the next thing is using the update in a Web API. And the way that we update in Web API is through save all, repository save all, and what we do is we update the actual entity in our memory and then call save all. And there are other things, in order to do it, but we begin by creating a put or patch. The difference between put and patch is that when we're using a put, we have to work with the whole entire object, whereas with patch we can only work with one part of the object that we submit back and forth. So we don't have to submit the whole object back and forth. We can only work with the part if you use patch. And we can also use those two interchangeable by using the attribute HTTP patch or HTTP put. But to get started, the first thing that we need to do to enable our updating is we need to go ahead and create a patch, and here we do need to accept our diary ID, our ID of our entry, and also the model, kind of like from the post similarly. Except with the post we didn't really need the individual ID. So here's our patch method. It gets a diary ID, entry ID, which is just ID, and then we get our diary entry model from the client. So the process that we have to do here is we need to first retrieve the actual entity of the model that we are trying to, of the object that we are trying to update. So we need to get the object in memory that we are trying to update through our entity. So let's do that first. Okay, so here's our entity. Now we actually have it in memory. The one that we want to change, we pass the ID and we get an instance of our entity that we want to change. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to take the value that we changed from the client, which is now resting inside of our model, and parse it into the entity. We're going to use that using that parse method. So now that we have our parsed entity, basically what we have here is entity that has the new value in it. What we want to do is we want to update our entity object here to update it with the value from the parsed entity. Because in order for our save all to work, we can only work with the entity. We can't send the parsed entity to our repository. So let's go ahead and put the value to the entity, and then we call the save all on our repository. So what that does is takes now our updated entity with a new quantity and it saves it. And as I'm trying to run it the way it is, and this is very good indicator why we need more infrastructure here to handle some of these things. First of all, we can see that the parsed entity is null. So if parsed entity is null, we can't, we're trying to assign null here to the quantity. But parsed entity is null, there's no quantity in it, so the whole thing is breaking. So we need a better way to construct this, and I will be showing that too, but for now let's see why is it null. And it's null here because we are trying to, this is failing because we're trying to build this measure URI, but we don't really have this here. So what we need to do is we need to say if this measure URI is empty, not to do any of this. So I ran it, the update ran, and it returned the null because I don't have anything to handle any responses appropriately. But let's see what happened here if it actually updated. So the ID of 15, the ID of 15 is now 5. So the update did work. So in a nutshell, those are the steps that we need to do in order to create the update. So we need to get the instance of our entity, then we need to parse our model into our entity, update the entity's quantity with the parsed entity quantity, and then do repository save all. Now we got to do some things here to make this work appropriately with the web API. So first thing that we need to do is we need to make this into the response message, our patch, instead of the object, and then we'll go ahead and put try catch. If any errors happen, we need to go ahead and catch them and pass the error response back. So we went ahead and created the this change it to HTTP response message. We put in a catch here, and we're catching the exception and passing it by using a request.create error response HTTP status code bad request, passing that. So the next thing that we need to do is when we get our entity here, before we continue, we need to make sure that the entity is not null. So before we continue on, it would make sense to make sure that we actually have this entity. So we say if entity is null, we go ahead and break out of the method and return not found. So we don't have this entity. Then the next thing that we need to do is also when we do our parsed entry, like the error that we got earlier, we need to make sure that parsed entry is not null. So if parsed entry is null, we return bad request response. And next thing that we need to do is before we assign this quantity, parse quantity to our quantity here, we need to make sure that they're different. So here we make sure that our quantity that came back in our entity and the quantity that we parsed out that came from our client, those two don't match, they're not the same, and then we go ahead and assign it. And then also when we're doing our save all, just like we did with most of the other post and delete, we need to go ahead and return the appropriate response when this runs. So when the save all runs, if it runs, it returns the true. So we say if everything went okay, break out a method and send the status okay. And then if it didn't, if it went through all of these, what we want to do is we want to put like a fall through bad request. So if none of these happens, then we just return a bad request. So that's basically how we do our patch. And also another really important thing to note here is that we can, by changing these attributes, we can put HTTP patch. Now this method will work with both patch and put. So if we go here to our composer, let's update that one to 10, and now instead of patch, if we pass put,
these attributes on the method tell it that these are the two verbs it's going to use. By using the attributes, you're telling it to not infer it by the name, but simply to use the attributes as the designator of what verbs are going to call this method. So if we come back here and change it to put, and of course change the quantity because we have the test in there to only update it if the quantity has been changed, you can see that put also works because we've included the attributes of put and patch on here. So now we have all four logical verbs implemented on the diary entries controller. We've got.
So when I saved this, I was able to run it with a put and it worked. So this is how we do our updates using put and patch.